I'm Jake, 35, and I had no idea the mess I was about to walk into when I got a call from my bank about a $150,000 loan I supposedly co-signed. My first thought was that this had to be some kind of mistake. There's no way I'd co-sign for anyone, especially not for that kind of money. After talking to the bank, I found out that the loan was taken out by my parents. They had forged my signature to help finance my sister Clara's lavish wedding. Now Clara and I don't get along and haven't spoken in years. She's always been the spoiled one. And while I used to blame my parents for how she turned out, Clara's now 28 and should have grown up by now. But she hasn't. We barely acknowledge each other when we're forced to be in the same room at family gatherings, and we've both accepted that we're not meant to be close. So imagine my anger when I found out that not only was I left out of the wedding, but I was also being roped into paying for it without even being asked. Clara's been with her fiancé Max for a couple of years, and they recently got engaged. I knew I wasn't going to be invited to the wedding, and honestly, I didn't care. But what I did care about was being used as a co-signer for a loan without my permission. When I confronted my parents about it, I wanted to believe there was some misunderstanding, maybe a mistake at the bank. But no, they admitted it without hesitation. Worse, they tried to justify it. My mom had the nerve to tell me that as Clara's brother, it was my duty to help out with the wedding. Apparently, they couldn't afford the over-the-top ceremony Clara had her heart set on, so they took out the loan. But instead of asking me, they figured they'd just forge my signature and deal with the consequences later. Their reasoning? They knew I wasn't on good terms with Clara and figured I'd say no if they asked me to co-sign. So they just decided to do it behind my back, thinking I wouldn't find out until it was too late to stop the loan. What they didn't count on was the bank calling to verify the loan details before approving it. I was furious. I told them straight up that they were going to pay for what they'd done. I couldn't believe they would put me in this position, especially knowing that I've been working on starting my own business for months now. I've been planning to quit my job soon, and they know how important this venture is to me. Taking out this loan in my name would put me on the hook if they couldn't make the payments, potentially ruining my credit and my plans. My mom, of course, started crying as she always does when she doesn't get her way. My dad tried to guilt-trip me, saying it was my responsibility as a member of the family to help them out. He even tried to say that if I went ahead and sued them, it would reflect badly on the family and ruin Clara's engagement. The whole time, they acted like the real issue was me not helping out with the wedding, not the fact that they'd committed fraud. After hanging up, I called my lawyer and explained the situation. I needed to protect myself legally, and I was serious about suing them. But part of me was still struggling with whether or not to go public with this whole mess. They're my parents, after all, and airing out family drama isn't something I take lightly. But then I got a copy of the loan terms from the bank. And that's when everything changed for me. There was a clause that stated the entire loan would have to be repaid within 2 years. Knowing my parents, they wouldn't be able to make those payments, and that meant the burden would fall on me. They knew about my business plans and still went ahead with this, not caring how it would affect me. At that point, I snapped. I decided that not only was I going to sue them, but I was going to make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of people they were. So I did something I probably shouldn't have. I went on Facebook and found Max's profile. I sent him a message explaining everything, detailing how my parents had forged my signature for a loan to pay for the wedding. I also messaged a few of his family members. I figured if Clara knew about this and was fine with it, then Max deserved to know what kind of family he was marrying into. Not long after, my phone started blowing up. My parents were hysterical because Clara had found out what they'd done. She hadn't known they forged my signature or that they'd taken out a loan at all. She was furious with them, and my parents were furious with me for telling her fiancé. They tried to blame me for everything, saying it was my fault for dragging Max and his family into it. But honestly, I didn't care at that point. I was done with their lies and manipulation. Clara even reached out to me, which surprised me since we hadn't spoken in years. She accused me of ruining her life, saying that I should have just dealt with my parents directly instead of involving Max. She claimed she had no idea they'd done this and would never have let them if she'd known. She was probably telling the truth. Clara may be spoiled and entitled, but she's not a liar. As much as I hate to admit it, she had a point. Maybe I should have spoken to her first, but I was too angry and I acted on impulse. Now her relationship with Max was on shaky ground, and part of me felt bad. But another part of me thought she deserved to know what kind of people our parents are, even if it cost her the wedding she always dreamed of. After the whole mess with my sister Clara blew up, I decided to take a step back and figure out what to do next. Suing my parents was still on the table, but I needed to see if there was any way to minimize the damage. As much as I wanted to wash my hands of them, we were still family. But the fact that they forged my signature without even a second thought, that wasn't something I could just overlook. I sent Clara a message apologizing for dragging her fiancé, Max, and his family into this without talking to her first. I was honest with her, telling her that given our history, I thought she might have known about what our parents had done. I offered to reach out to Max again and try to fix things if that would help. She didn't respond right away, but at least I'd extended an olive branch. The next few days were tense. I didn't hear from my parents, which was probably for the best. I needed time to cool off before taking any more drastic steps, but I wasn't going to let this slide. So I started gathering everything I needed from my lawyer. I had screenshots of the bank correspondence, my parents' admission that they forged my signature, and a list of all the details they'd used to impersonate me. In the meantime, Clara finally replied. She was calmer this time, but still angry. She didn't exactly forgive me for what I'd done, but she did admit that our parents were in the wrong. According to her, they'd been under so much pressure from her to make the wedding happen that they panicked and went behind my back. Clara insisted that if she had known about the loan, she never would have let them do it. I wasn't sure whether to believe her entirely, but it seemed genuine enough. She said she was going to talk to Max and his family again to explain her side, but she wasn't hopeful. Apparently, Max's parents were old-fashioned and didn't take kindly to this kind of dishonesty, even if Clara wasn't directly involved. I wished her luck, but I couldn't help feeling like this situation was too far gone to repair. Meanwhile, I was still on the warpath with my parents. I contacted the bank and let them know I was pursuing legal action. It turns out the loan hadn't been fully approved yet, thanks to my earlier intervention, but it was still a mess. They apologized profusely and said they would work with my lawyer to sort things out. I decided to go no contact with my parents, at least for the time being. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but after years of putting up with their favoritism and manipulation, this was the final straw. They had clearly shown that my feelings and future didn't matter to them as much as Clara's happiness did. And for what? A wedding that could have easily been scaled back or funded by her and Max's combined savings. It didn't make sense, and it was infuriating. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, Clara's engagement fell apart. I started getting texts from family members asking if I knew what had happened. Apparently, Clara had posted on social media that she and Max had called it off. She didn't give any details, but of course everyone wanted to gossip about it. The problem? Clara had recently blocked me on all her accounts, so I had no idea what was going on until people started asking me. At first, I felt a little guilty, wondering if my actions had played a part in this. But after a few hours of reflection, I realized that Max deserved to know the truth, and if that led to him rethinking the relationship, then maybe it wasn't meant to be. I mean, if he had stuck around after finding out what my parents had done, I would have questioned his judgment. The next morning, I was jolted awake by someone banging on my door. It didn't take a genius to figure out who it was, Clara. She's always had a flair for drama, so showing up unannounced and unhinged wasn't out of character for her. I debated whether to answer the door or not, but when she started yelling through the door, I knew I had to deal with it. "Jake, I know you're in there. Open the door or I swear I'll break it down," she screamed, kicking the door like a madwoman. I walked over, half asleep, and told her to leave, threatening to call the cops if she didn't. That just made her angrier. She started accusing me of ruining her life, claiming that it was all my fault that Max had left her. According to her, after I sent those messages to him and his family, they confronted her, and when she couldn't explain why she was still in contact with our parents, everything fell apart. Max apparently demanded the truth, and Clara, feeling cornered, admitted that she had known about the forged loan. I was taken aback. All this time, she had insisted she didn't know anything about it. but now she was telling me she'd been in on it from the start. The only reason she hadn't said anything before was that she thought the bank would never reach out to me. She had gambled on me never finding out, and when I did, the whole thing came crashing down. Max left her because she hadn't cut ties with our parents after what they did, and now her engagement was officially over. Clara was furious, not just at me, but at our parents as well. She started venting about how they should have just found another way to pay for the wedding instead of dragging me into it, and how they were to blame for the mess her life had become. But of course, she still blamed me the most for blowing everything up. "You had no right to get involved, Jake. You ruined everything," she shouted, her face red with anger. I let her finish her rant before calmly telling her that if she had been honest from the start, none of this would have happened. If she had just owned up to her part in the mess, maybe things would have turned out differently. But instead, she lied, and now she was paying the price for it. She stormed off after that, and I haven't heard from her since. It felt good to finally have the upper hand, but there was also a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that things had spiraled out of control. I had acted out of anger, and while I still believed that my parents deserved what was coming to them, I wasn't sure if Clara's engagement falling apart was entirely justified. After she left, I got back to focusing on my lawsuit. I wasn't going to let my parents off the hook, no matter how much they tried to guilt me into backing down. The whole situation with Clara only strengthened my resolve. They needed to face the consequences of their actions, and I was done being the second priority in this family. It was time to put myself first. A couple of weeks had passed since Clara's explosive visit. Things had gone quiet, but I knew it was the calm before the storm. I hadn't heard from my parents, which was odd considering they were still at the center of the lawsuit. But Clara, well, I hadn't expected to hear from her again. That whole morning felt surreal. Her engagement was over, my parents were drowning in the mess they created, and I was gearing up to take legal action. It felt like the culmination of years of resentment and frustration finally reaching its peak. Then one morning, I woke up to a knock on my door, softer this time. When I opened it, Clara stood there looking defeated. No screaming, no kicking, just her, quiet, like the anger had drained out of her. For a second, I almost didn't recognize her. She came in without saying a word, and I could tell something big was on her mind. Clara was never one to back down, and she certainly wasn't one to apologize. So when she finally spoke, I knew it was serious. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I sat down across from her, ready for whatever was coming next. "I knew," she started. "I knew everything from the beginning. At first, I didn't understand what she was talking about." "Knew what?" "I knew about the loan," she admitted, not even looking me in the eye. "I knew Mom and Dad forged your signature. I helped them. They didn't want to tell you because they thought you'd say no, and I didn't want to hear another no either." For a second, I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. She had known. The whole time she had been lying to me, pretending she was innocent in all of this. All the accusations she threw at me for ruining her life. All the yelling and crying. It was just to cover up her own guilt. "You helped them?" I asked, my voice steady but cold. She nodded, and for once, Clara didn't try to shift the blame or make excuses. "Yeah, I did. I didn't think it would get this far. I didn't think you'd find out, but now everything's falling apart and I don't know what to do." Her confession hit me like a truck. This wasn't just about my parents anymore. It was about her, too. All the years I spent thinking Clara was just a spoiled brat who benefited from my parents' favoritism, I hadn't realized she was actively involved in manipulating things behind the scenes. She had been complicit in all of it. "So all that stuff you said? About not knowing? About Max leaving you because of me?" "It was a lie," she interrupted, her voice cracking. "I told him the truth after you sent those messages. That's why he left. He said he couldn't marry someone who would do that to their own brother, and I can't blame him." I didn't say anything for a while. I just sat there processing everything. I thought I had already reached my limit for how much I could resent my family, but this was something else. Clara had actively worked with my parents to forge my signature and sabotage my future, all for the sake of her dream wedding. And you only told me this now because... What? You feel bad that it all blew up in your face? I asked, feeling the anger rise again. She looked up at me, eyes red and tired. No, I'm telling you because I don't know what else to do. I screwed up, Jake. I know I did. I lost Max, and I've probably lost you too. But I can't keep pretending I'm the victim in all of this. I wanted to scream at her, tell her that this was all her fault, that she didn't deserve any sympathy from me. But there was something about the way she looked, so broken, so far from the arrogant sister I knew, that made me pause. Do Mom and Dad know you're here? I asked. Instead, She shook her head. No, they still think I'm mad at them for dragging you into this. They don't know I was involved from the start. Typical Clara, trying to keep her hands clean even when she was the dirtiest one in the room. I sighed and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. So, what do you want from me? I finally asked. I don't know, she admitted. I guess I just wanted to come clean. I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not sure I even deserve it. The silence between us stretched on for what felt like forever. Part of me wanted to kick her out of my apartment and never speak to her again. But another part of me, the part that had always wanted things to be better between us, felt conflicted. I'm still going to sue them, I said finally. And you? She flinched but didn't argue. I figured. But I'll tell Max the truth, that you came clean, that you weren't just hiding behind our parents' lies. Maybe that'll help. Clara's eyes widened in surprise, but she quickly masked it with a nod. Thanks, she muttered. I appreciate that. I watched her leave, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had the upper hand in this twisted family dynamic. But it didn't bring me the satisfaction I thought it would. Sure, I had exposed Clara's involvement, and I was still planning on going after my parents legally, but something inside me had shifted. I wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion of fighting all these years, or just the realization that no matter what, we were still bound by blood. And that, for better or worse, would always complicate things. Later that night, I sent a message to Max, telling him everything Clara had confessed. I didn't sugarcoat anything, but I made sure to let him know that she had at least tried to come clean, even if it was too late. Whether or not it made a difference to him was out of my hands. I just wanted to make sure the truth was out there. A couple of days passed without incident, and I thought maybe, just maybe, things were settling down. Then I got a call from my lawyer. Apparently my parents were now willing to come to an out-of-court settlement. It seemed they had finally realized the gravity of the situation, or maybe they just couldn't handle the pressure anymore. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Part of me wanted to drag them through the courts, make them face public humiliation for what they'd done. But another part of me, the part that had been worn down by years of family drama, just wanted it all to end. Maybe a settlement would give me the closure I needed to move on with my life. As the legal negotiations began, I couldn't help but feel a weird sense of relief. I knew I wasn't going to forgive my parents, or Clara for that matter, but at least I was taking steps toward cutting myself free from their control. They had used me, lied to me, and taken advantage of my trust for too long. Now it was my turn to take back control. The settlement talks were slow, but I didn't mind. I had time to think, to process everything that had happened. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about the loan. It was about a lifetime of being treated like I didn't matter, like I was second to Clara in everything. This lawsuit, this whole situation, was my way of finally standing up for myself. As the settlement talks dragged on, I found myself thinking more and more about my relationship with my parents and Clara. It wasn't just the forged loan that had brought me to this point. It was years of being sidelined, years of favoritism, years of being the backup plan when Clara didn't need them to fulfill her every whim. The lawsuit wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about making a statement, to them and to myself, that I wasn't going to let them walk all over me anymore. My lawyer kept me updated on the negotiations. It was clear my parents were desperate to avoid going to court. They were offering to pay a significant amount to get me to drop the lawsuit, and while it wasn't going to ruin them financially, it was definitely more than they were comfortable with. I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction at the thought of them scrambling to fix the mess they had created. But despite that, a part of me was still conflicted. Then, out of nowhere, Clara called me. I hadn't heard from her since she'd confessed everything. I didn't expect her to call, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to answer, but I did. "Hey," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "Can we talk?" I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "What's left to talk about, Clara?" I don't know. I wanted to tell you that I'm leaving," she said. "Leaving? Where are you going?" "Colorado. I've decided to move," she said, sounding more defeated than I had ever heard her. "There's nothing left for me here. Max is gone, Mom and Dad are a wreck, and I've burned every bridge." It took me a second to process what she was saying. Clara, the golden child, the one who had always gotten her way, was running away. She had spent years at the center of our parents' universe, and now that things weren't going her way, she was giving up and leaving. "When are you going?" I asked, not entirely sure what else to say. "In a week. I just thought you should know before I left," she replied. There was a long silence on the line. I didn't know how to feel about her leaving. Part of me was relieved that I wouldn't have to deal with her anymore, but another part of me, the part that had always wanted some kind of resolution between us, felt strangely hollow. "Okay," I finally said. "Good luck, I guess." "Thanks," she muttered. "And, Jake, I'm really sorry for everything." It was the first real apology I'd ever heard from her, but it felt too little, too late. Still, I accepted it for what it was. "Yeah, me too," I said, even though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. After that, the call ended, and I sat there for a long time just staring at my phone. Clara was really gone, and with her went any hope of fixing the relationship we'd never had. Maybe it was for the best. We weren't meant to be close, and it seemed like no amount of effort on either of our parts would change that. As the week went on, I kept getting updates from my lawyer about the settlement. My parents were pushing harder now, likely spurred on by the fact that Clara was leaving and their golden child was slipping away from them. They were offering to pay the full amount I had asked for in exchange for dropping the lawsuit. And as much as I wanted to see them squirm in court, I realized that it wasn't worth the emotional energy anymore. I had made my point. They knew I wasn't going to roll over for them again. In the end, I accepted the settlement. It was a large enough sum that it would set me up nicely for my business, and more importantly, it was my way of cutting ties. The money didn't mean as much to me as the freedom it represented. I wouldn't be under their thumb anymore, and I didn't have to deal with their manipulation or guilt trips. They had made their bed, and now they had to lie in it. As part of the settlement, I agreed not to pursue any further legal action, and in return, they promised to never contact me again unless it was an absolute emergency. It was a clean break, or as clean as it could be given the circumstances. My lawyer assured me that the terms were solid, and once the paperwork was signed, I would be free of them. The final meeting with my lawyer felt like a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief because I was finally free, but sadness because at the end of the day, they were still my parents. Cutting them off wasn't easy, but it was necessary. After everything was finalized, I called a few close friends to let them know what had happened. They had been supportive throughout the whole ordeal, and it felt good to share the news that it was over. The overwhelming response from them was that I had done the right thing, and for the first time in a long time, I believed it. The next few days were oddly quiet. With the lawsuit behind me and Clara gone, I had time to focus on my business. I quit my job the same week the settlement was finalized and threw myself into my new venture. It felt like a fresh start, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel weighed down by family drama. But there was one final twist in the story. A few weeks after Clara left, I received a letter from her. It was short, only a few paragraphs, but it was the closest thing to closure I'd ever get from her. She apologized again for everything and told me that she hoped I could find it in myself to forgive our parents one day, even if it was just for my own peace of mind. She ended the letter by saying that she was trying to figure out who she was without them, and she hoped I could do the same. I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me wanted to tear the letter up, but another part of me held on to it, unsure of what the future held. Maybe one day I'd be able to forgive them, but for now, I was content with the distance I had created. As I look back on everything, I realized that this whole situation was about more than just a loan or a wedding. It was about breaking free from the toxic dynamic I had been trapped in for so long. My parents had chosen Clara over me my entire life, but now, for the first time, I was choosing myself. And that felt good. I don't know what the future holds for my relationship with my parents or Clara, but I do know one thing. I'm done living in their shadow. This was the beginning of a new chapter for me, one where I get to write my own story, free from the weight of their expectations. And honestly, it feels like a huge weight has finally been lifted.